like what was wine in the ancient world, right? And could it have been spiked with mushrooms or other visionary plants, hallucinogenic herbs, toxins? I think that is a really interesting question, not only because there's data in the sources, but because for the first time, we're unearthing hard, scientific, organic data to actually support what was in those ancient chalices.
Murarescu thinks that the Kekion drink consumed at the Eleusinian mystery rituals contained ergot, a fungus that grows on wheat and contains LSD.
Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. wrote about the influence of the mystery religions on Christianity as far back as 1950. You can't ignore the similarities from the pagan world to the Christian world, and he attributes it to an unconscious process of ceremonies and rites from antiquity making their way into Christianity.
So a lot of this is centered around this specific spiritual capital. If Athens was sort of the political capital, you had 13 miles northwest of Athens this center called Eleusis, where these mystery rituals went on. What exactly happened there?
I wish I knew, Jesse. That's what I've been trying to figure out for 25 years. Nobody knows.
Yeah.
This is the fight club of the ancient world. Whatever happened there, no one talked about it, under penalty of death. So it was taken quite seriously, but what we're essentially talking about are very elaborate rites of death and rebirth. And not as some footnote, not as an afterthought. This was, in some senses, the spiritual epicenter of the ancient Mediterranean. It called to Plato and Sophocles and Pindar. It called to Cicero in the 1st century BC, who called Eleusis the most divine and exceptional thing Athens ever produced.
And a lot of this was somewhat pre-Socratic. So you have a favorite author, Peter Kingsley.
I do.
And this famous quote, "If you die before you die, you will not die when you die," which kind of touches on what you were just talking about with Plato. So what is this element of simulating death? What does it do to an individual person? Do you have any sort of sense?
Well, that's the mystery.
Yeah.
Whatever it does to somebody is transformative. I mean, people went to Eleusis as human beings, and from what little testimony survived, again because it's secret under penalty of death, they walked away thinking they were immortal. An pethanis, prin pethanis, dentha pethanis, otan pethanis. If you die before you die, you won't die when you die. And I do think it harkens back to this ancient tradition of confronting our mortality in order to achieve immortality. Something happens in that dissolving of the ego, right? The self that we normally identify with, our passions, emotions, our experiences, our psyche, our psychology. Something happens when that is under threat and when it disappears. And so to Plato's point, the way that they saw these mysteries was not so much a learning process, although there were things to learn, there were rituals to perform. It was almost an unlearning process of kind of shedding back, peeling back the layers of the onion.
So you start writing the book 12 years ago, is that right? And what's the purpose of the book? Like, why do you think it's important that people realize this? What are the implications for today?
Because we're suffering from an identity crisis. It's partly why we're sitting here. There's this narrative that the ancient Greeks essentially draft the blueprints for Western civilization, and in comes Christianity to save our soul. And there is the divide. There's the big divide between reason and faith, right? Or between science and religion, and it's still here today.
And Huxley predicts that there might be a religion around psychedelics, possibly a new Eleusis,
right,
which Albert Hoffman talks about as well. Do you think that happens? And if so, what form does it take? Is it state sanctioned? Is it outside of the state?
I mean, that's a good question. I mean, over the next 10 years, I think you're going to see a bit of everything. So the state-sanctioned Eleusinian kind of ordered mysteries, I see the FDA. Like what's happening in Oregon, for example. It's crazy to think about like a regulated ecosystem for therapeutic psilocybin. I mean, that was unthinkable a few years ago. So there's the state intervening to produce, again, these set and settings where these irrational states of mind seem to have incredible medicinal purpose, right? For everything from anxiety, depression, end-of-life distress, PTSD, etc. There is a place for that kind of sanctioned medicine. You're going to have the underground, the Dionysian wild kind of, from Woodstock to Burning Man. It never really went anywhere, and Grateful Dead helped it along the way. So you're always going to have a part of that. And then, just maybe, in kind of a harmony between the two, is the First Amendment, which, again, there seems to be a compelling argument for the responsible, sincere, very sacred use of things like psychedelics within religious exercise, right? It's kind of guaranteed by the First Amendment. Before the right to free speech and assembly is that right to religion. What else is America known for but for that? And so we don't have a clear path yet. I mean, there's some use of psychedelics in the Native American church, some Brazilian-spawned churches, but I think the next 10 years you're going to see things like psilocybin, maybe LSD, DMT, and others begin to float their way into either new churches or maybe even organized religion.
What do you say to the person who reads Plato and says, well, that's just a guardian creating kind of a noble myth? And in fact, this is all just a lie to make me believe, in the afterlife. And it's sort of, as Nietzsche would say, some sort of slave morality to de-emphasize the material life, which is all there is.
That's a great explanation. That could very well be the case. Maybe we're just all inventing it so we can feel better as we pass on to death. I mean, there are folks who look at near-death literature like that. Why do we see the white light? Why would we be equipped for this experience as we're dying? Does it help us die? Does it help those around us experience our death better? I don't know why these near-death phenomena occur. Is there a biological, evolutionary basis for it? What would that be there for? Why would our death be facilitated in that way for purely physiological purposes? I don't know. And these myths and Plato, I have no idea. But I would say, again, about Plato, that his philosophy was the practicing of death and being dead. And I would invite someone who's interested in Plato to look to his guru, right? Like Parmenides or Empedocles or Pythagoras or the pre-Socratics. What were they doing? What were these rites of incubation that they were practicing? Like going into underground temples, essentially, to meet a goddess, to go into altered states of consciousness, where they could barely feel the pulse, treading somewhere between life and death, waking, and the dream state. This was part and parcel of ancient Greek civilization.
And you've never had a psychedelic experience, is that right?
I'm having one right now, Jesse.
You've never had a psychedelic experience, but have you had any experiences, any near-death experiences, or any experiences that might be...
Here we go. Right. I had a near-death experience when I was 5, which I wasn't prepared for at 5. My older brother, God bless his heart, accidentally hit me in the head with a golf club right here. I still have a hole in my head. I guess I was hit with so much adrenaline that I didn't feel any pain. And I actually remember being in the car, bleeding to death, my mother holding me, and asking her why she was crying, because I couldn't feel anything, and I thought everything was fine, and I felt bliss. I felt enormous bliss and comfort. And we get to the hospital, and I'm rushed into surgery, and as the anesthesia kicks in, I feel like I leave my body. And what happens is what I describe as a dream. And maybe it was a dream. I don't know what the hell it was. But I remember waking up with this vivid imagery of meeting people and discussing things and being told things. And I wake up at 5 not knowing what to do with all that until 10 years later or 20 years later, and I'm reading near-death literature and I'm reading about mystical experiences. And it seems to me that this whole dying before dying process is an actual thing that I wasn't looking for. But when I read the literature on psychedelics, I see a technology, right? That's how Aldous Huxley described it, like a technology, a biochemical discovery that under very controlled conditions seems to produce sometimes a very vivid near-death experience, which is kind of worth exploring.
I think so too. So you had your own mystery ritual.
Maybe so. Maybe so.
Maybe, we don't know. And I'll let you leave the contents hermetically sealed for fear of punishment.
Excellent.
But yeah, I mean the thing about Huxley, he was very interested in and a fan of William James's transmission theory of consciousness. And if you think about what psilocybin does to the brain, is it silences activity in the default mode network, which is the anterior and posterior cingulate of the brain, which is really where, if you were to house the ego in any part of the brain, it would be there. All of your fears about the future, worries about the past are in that sort of region. And so maybe if you quell or subdue that part of the brain, you are increasing your ability to tether to elsewhere or something. You're receiving more kind of wisdom or information from elsewhere.
It's the hard problem of consciousness that no one has solved, and maybe we never will. But does the brain generate everything that we experience, or does it transceive? Does it modulate consciousness? Does consciousness exist with or without us, right?
Yeah.
With or without this physical body? I mean, it's hard to answer that phenomenologically, but again, these near-death states, whether at the end of physical life or through some traumatic event, or maybe in the purposeful induction of them, I think these are great kind of like border areas for research.